She told me to stay in the back and keep my mouth shut. Said I was embarrassing the family with my outdated ideas and inappropriate questions. But when Principal Morrison took that microphone and announced, "Our largest anonymous donor has been revealed as Mrs. Eleanor Carter," you should have seen my daughter-in-law's face crumble like wet paper. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not according to Vanessa, anyway. The Riverside Elementary Spring Fundraiser was a young parents-only event. She'd explained over dinner 3 weeks prior, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "It's really more about networking with the other families in Theo's grade," she'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You know how these things can get political. Political. As if wanting to know where the school's money actually went was somehow controversial. But I came anyway. I'd been coming to these fundraisers for 6 years, ever since my grandson started kindergarten, and I wasn't about to stop now just because Vanessa had decided I was an inconvenience. I arrived at the Riverside Community Center in my navy blazer and sensible flats, carrying the small notepad I always brought to take notes about the school's financial reports. The gymnasium buzzed with conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. Parents clustered around silent auction tables displaying spa weekends and restaurant gift certificates, their voices carrying that particular pitch of forced enthusiasm that comes with mandatory social events. I spotted my son David near the basketball hoop, looking uncomfortable in his pressed khakis, while Vanessa worked the room like she was running for mayor. I made my way toward the registration table, but Vanessa intercepted me before I could reach it. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Eleanor," she said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold. "I thought we discussed this." "We discussed your opinion," I replied calmly. "I don't recall agreeing to it." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Look, I know you mean well, but these people don't need to hear your concerns about transparency. It reflects poorly on David's reputation in the community." "Asking where donated money goes reflects poorly?" "Asking 20 questions about every line item makes people uncomfortable," she hissed. "Just stay in the back tonight, okay? Let David and me handle the social aspects. Try to stay quiet for once." She steered me toward a row of folding chairs positioned behind the concession stand, far from where the real action would unfold. I sat down without protest, folding my hands in my lap. But I didn't stay quiet. I never did. Some habits, especially the important ones, are too hard to break. Little did Vanessa know, I'd been anything but quiet for the past 6 years. The fundraiser kicked into full swing with Principal Morrison welcoming everyone from the makeshift stage. Parents applauded politely as he outlined the evening's agenda: silent auction, dinner service, and the presentation of this year's funding goals. The gymnasium filled with the kind of orchestrated cheer that comes with obligations disguised as opportunities. I watched from my assigned exile behind the concession stand as Vanessa glided between groups, her laugh ringing out at precisely the right moments. She'd positioned herself near the front with the other committee mothers, women who treated the PTA like their personal boardroom. David lingered awkwardly at the edges, occasionally nodding when someone addressed him directly. When Morrison called for questions about the proposed technology upgrade, I started to rise from my chair. The school desperately needed new computers, but the quoted price seemed inflated compared to what I'd researched independently. Before I could speak, Vanessa's head snapped toward me like a heat-seeking missile. She crossed the gymnasium in record time, her heels clicking against the polished floor with military precision. "What are you doing?" she whispered urgently, grabbing my elbow. "They're overpaying for those computers by at least 30%, I said quietly. "Someone should mention—" "Absolutely not." Her grip tightened. "We talked about this." "Vanessa, I'm just trying to help." "No." Her voice carried farther than she intended, drawing glances from nearby parents. She noticed and immediately shifted into damage control mode, forcing her expression into something resembling maternal concern. Eleanor gets a little confused about these technical matters, she announced to the small crowd that had gathered. Technology isn't really her generation's strong suit. The condescending laughter that followed felt like a slap. Mrs. Patterson from the art committee tittered behind her hand. Mr. Hendricks, who coached Little League, shook his head with the kind of indulgent smile reserved for elderly relatives who'd outlived their usefulness. Maybe she should stick to bake sales, someone murmured, causing another ripple of amusement. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't the first time Vanessa had publicly diminished me, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She had a talent for making me feel small while maintaining her image as the dutiful daughter-in-law. You're right, I said calmly, settling back into my chair. I should probably just listen. Vanessa's smile was triumphant as she returned to her position near the front. She'd successfully neutered the old woman again, demonstrated her control over the family dynamics, and earned approving nods from her social circle. What she didn't know was that my silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The silent auction wound down as parents circled the display tables one final time, placing last-minute bids on weekend getaways and local restaurant packages. I remained in my designated spot, observing the familiar dance of suburban fundraising. The same families dominated the high-value items, the same polite conversations about property values and college prep programs echoed across the gymnasium. Principal Morrison returned to the microphone, shuffling through a stack of note cards. Before we announce tonight's auction winners, he began, I have a very special recognition to share with you all. Vanessa straightened, probably assuming this involved her committee work. She'd spent months positioning herself as the face of the spring fundraiser, sending endless emails about decoration themes and vendor coordination. David looked relieved that the evening was nearing its end. As you know, Morrison continued, Riverside Elementary has undergone remarkable improvements over the past 6 years. Our new playground equipment, the library renovation, the art studio expansion, and our upcoming technology center. None of this would have been possible without extraordinary generosity from our school community. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Parents nodded approvingly, mentally calculating their own modest contributions against tax deductions. Morrison's expression grew more serious. Tonight, I'm honored to reveal the identity of someone who has preferred to remain anonymous, but who has given permission for this recognition. Over the past 6 years, one family has contributed over $380,000 to our school's capital improvements. The gymnasium fell silent. $380,000 was more than most families earned in a year, let alone donated to an elementary school. Parents exchanged glances, trying to identify which of the obvious candidates, the Hendersons with their tech startup money, or the Bradfords who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, could afford such generosity. This family has funded our emergency scholarship program, covered the costs for students who couldn't afford field trips, and even quietly paid for our school lunches program expansion. Morrison paused, scanning the crowd. They've done all of this while specifically requesting no public recognition, no naming rights, no plaques or ceremonies. I felt a flutter in my stomach. Only 3 people knew the full extent of my donations: Morrison, the district superintendent, and my financial advisor. I'd been very careful about maintaining anonymity, partly for tax purposes, but mostly because I believed charity should be private. However, Morrison continued, recent circumstances have made this recognition necessary, and I have been given permission to share this information tonight. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering why Morrison was spending so much time on some mystery donor when her committee deserved recognition. Morrison smiled, his eyes finding mine across the crowded gymnasium. Ladies and gentlemen, our largest anonymous donor has been revealed as Mrs. Eleanor Carter. The silence that followed was deafening. The gymnasium erupted in confused murmurs as parents turned to locate me in the crowd. I felt dozens of eyes scanning the room, searching for this mysterious Mrs. Carter, who had apparently been hiding in plain sight for 6 years. From my position behind the concession stand, I could see the exact moment recognition dawned on various faces. Vanessa's expression was a masterpiece of shock and horror. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. David's eyes widened as he stared directly at me, his face cycling through confusion, realization, and something that might have been pride. I think there's been some mistake, Vanessa called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space. She forced a laugh that sounded brittle. Eleanor Carter is, well, she's my mother-in-law, and she's certainly not. She gestured vaguely, as if the idea of me having significant wealth was somehow physically impossible. Principal Morrison consulted his notes. I assure you there's no mistake. Mrs. Carter, would you please join me up here? I remained seated for a moment, weighing my options. For 6 years, I'd maintained my anonymity partly to avoid exactly this kind of attention. But Vanessa's public humiliation had forced Morrison's hand, and now I faced a choice. Continue hiding behind false modesty, or claim the recognition I'd specifically avoided. The decision made itself. I stood slowly, smoothing my navy blazer, and walked toward the front of the gymnasium. The crowd parted like I was carrying some contagious dignity they were afraid to catch. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa's heels clicking frantically as she tried to catch up. Eleanor, wait, she hissed under her breath. What is happening? How is this possible? I paused just long enough to meet her eyes. You told me to stay quiet, Vanessa. You never asked me to stay poor. The walk to the stage felt both eternal and instantaneous. Parents who had ignored me for years suddenly found my face fascinating. Mrs. Patterson, who had laughed at Vanessa's technology comment 20 minutes earlier, now stared at me with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Hendricks looked like he was trying to solve a complex math problem in his head. When I reached the microphone, Morrison handed me a folder. Mrs. Carter has been the driving force behind every major improvement at our school, he announced. Without her generosity, we would still have playground equipment from the 1980s and a library that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. I looked out at the crowd of faces, some amazed, some skeptical, some calculating. Vanessa stood frozen near the front, her perfect composure finally cracking. David had moved closer, and for the first time in months, he was looking at me like he saw his mother instead of an obligation. Thank you, Principal Morrison, I said into the microphone, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I suppose it's time we had an honest conversation about Riverside Elementary's future. The ride home was silent, except for the hum of David's hybrid engine and Vanessa's barely controlled breathing. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead like she was trying to will reality into a different shape. David kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. It wasn't until we pulled into their driveway that Vanessa finally spoke. How? The word came out sharp and accusatory. How do you have that kind of money? I waited while David turned off the engine. Your father's life insurance policy was more substantial than I let people believe, I said calmly, plus some investments that performed better than expected. $380,000? Her voice cracked on the number. You've been sitting on that kind of money while we've been struggling with Theo's orthodontist bills and the mortgage? David finally turned around. Mom, why didn't you tell us? The question was fair, but the answer was complicated. Because every time I offered to help with anything, Vanessa found reasons why it wasn't necessary. Remember when I suggested contributing to Theo's college fund? You told me it would create dependency. When I offered to help with your kitchen renovation, you said you preferred to handle things independently. Vanessa's face flushed. That's different. Those were personal family matters. This is charity, I supplied. Is it easier to accept my money when it goes to strangers? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. David rubbed his temples, looking exhausted. Let's go inside and talk about this properly. But I was just getting started. Over the past 6 years, I'd watched Vanessa systematically exclude me from family decisions while simultaneously criticizing my lifestyle. She'd made pointed comments about my outdated furniture, my unnecessary spending on books and gardening supplies, my wasteful habit of buying organic groceries, all while I was quietly funding her son's education. Inside their pristine living room, decorated in shades of beige that somehow managed to feel both expensive and sterile, Vanessa paced like a caged animal. This doesn't make sense, she muttered. If you had this money, why live in that tiny house? Why drive that old Honda? Why shop at discount stores? Because having money doesn't mean you have to waste it, I replied. Robert taught me that. Don't. David's voice was sharp. Don't bring Dad into this. But I needed him to understand. Your father grew up poor, David. Really poor. When his business finally succeeded, he never forgot what it felt like to worry about bills. He taught me that wealth is a responsibility, not a trophy. Vanessa stopped pacing. So you decided to take that responsibility to Theo's school instead of his family. I took it to where it would make the biggest difference, I said quietly. 20 families benefit from the scholarship program I funded. 60 children eat lunch every day because of the nutrition program. The playground equipment I purchased will serve hundreds of students over the next decade. But what about us? Vanessa's voice was smaller now, almost vulnerable. What about your own family? I looked at my son, seeing his father's stubborn jaw and careful eyes. I tried, David. I offered to help with Theo's private music lessons, and you said the public school program was adequate. I suggested family vacations, and Vanessa said you couldn't take time off work. I offered to contribute to home improvements, and you both insisted on earning your own way. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. The next morning, I called my financial advisor from the kitchen table where I'd been paying bills for 37 years. Margaret Russo had been handling my investment since Robert died, and she understood both my financial goals and my need for discretion. Eleanor, her voice was warm but concerned. I saw the news coverage from last night. Channel 7 ran a piece about the fundraiser revelation. How are you holding up? I hadn't expected media attention, but I should have. A 6-figure anonymous donor being revealed at a suburban school fundraiser was exactly the kind of feel-good story local news programs loved. I'm fine, Margaret, but I think it's time we reviewed all my charitable contributions. I have a feeling this is going to open some doors I didn't know were closed. What do you mean? I told her about Vanessa's shock, David's confusion, and the way the other parents had looked at me like I'd been hiding a secret identity. I think I need to understand exactly how much impact I've had and where the money has actually gone, not just at Riverside, but all of it. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, are you thinking about making changes to your giving strategy? I'm thinking about making changes to my transparency strategy. 2 hours later, I sat surrounded by printouts and spreadsheets that told a story I'd never seen in its entirety. Over the past 6 years, I donated $847,000 to various causes. Riverside Elementary was just the beginning. I'd funded after-school programs at 3 different schools, contributed to the local food bank's expansion, supported the library's literacy program, and helped establish a scholarship fund at the community college. But I'd also been quietly supporting my family in ways they'd never known. When David's engineering firm had struggled during the recession, I'd anonymously purchased a substantial consulting contract through a shell company Margaret had established. When Vanessa's mother needed expensive medical treatment, I'd arranged for the bills to be mysteriously reduced through a hospital charity program I'd been funding for years. The pattern was clear. I'd been taking care of everyone while allowing myself to be treated like a burden. My phone rang. David's number. "Mom, we need to talk." "I'm listening." "Vanessa called Principal Morrison this morning. She wanted to verify everything. The amounts, the timeline, all of it. And he sent her a detailed breakdown. Mom, you've been funding half the school's improvement projects for years. The other parents are calling it a miracle." I could hear Vanessa's voice in the background, sharp and agitated. "Is she upset?" I asked. "She's processing." "But Mom, there's something else. Morrison mentioned that you've been asking questions about budget transparency for years. He said you've been pushing for better financial reporting, more detailed project breakdowns, better communication with parents about how donations are used." "Yes. Vanessa always said you were being difficult, that you were questioning things unnecessarily." I waited, letting him work through the implications. "You weren't being difficult," he said finally. "You were being responsible. You wanted to make sure your money was being used properly." "Yes." "How much more is there, Mom? How much haven't you told us?" I looked at the spreadsheets covering my kitchen table. "Enough to change some lives, David. Including yours, if you'll let me." David arrived an hour later, alone. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, staring at the financial documents spread between us like evidence at a trial. His father's old coffee mug sat forgotten in his hands, growing cold while he processed the scope of what I'd been hiding. "The consulting contract," he said finally. 3 years ago, when the firm was struggling, that mysterious client who paid upfront for the infrastructure analysis project. "Carter Development Solutions," I confirmed. "Margaret helped me establish it. Perfectly legitimate, all the work was real, and you earned every dollar." "But you saved the company." "You saved the company. You did excellent work under impossible circumstances. I just provided the opportunity." He set down the mug and picked up another document. Vanessa's mother's medical bills. The hospital called it a charitable adjustment from their foundation. "I've been supporting their foundation for 5 years." "Jesus, Mom." He rubbed his face with both hands. "How much of our lives have you been secretly managing?" "Not managing," I said carefully. "Supporting. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been pulling strings behind the scenes while letting us struggle publicly." The accusation stung because it contained truth. "Would you have accepted direct help?" "We'll never know, will we? Because you never gave us the chance to try." I got up to refresh my coffee, needing movement to think clearly. "David, for 6 years I watched Vanessa criticize every suggestion I made. When I offered to help with Theo's college fund, she said it would teach him the wrong values. When I suggested family dinners, she said your schedules were too busy. When I asked about his school activities, she said I was being intrusive. So you went around her." "I went around both of you, because sometimes helping people means not asking permission." He followed me to the kitchen counter. "But why the school? Why so much focus on Riverside?" I turned to face him. "Because Theo spends 7 hours a day there. Because his education matters more than our family politics. And because I knew that even if Vanessa didn't want my help, She couldn't object to improvements that benefited her son. That's manipulative. That's strategic. We stared at each other across the small kitchen where I'd fed him countless meals, bandaged his scraped knees, and helped him with homework. Somewhere in his adult face, I could still see the 8-year-old who had trusted me to fix everything. "There's more," I said quietly. "Margaret found some irregularities in the school's financial reporting. Nothing illegal, but some questionable spending decisions that suggest not all donated funds are being used efficiently." David's expression sharpened. "What kind of irregularities?" I pulled out a different folder. Administrative salaries have increased by 40% over the past 3 years, while teacher salaries have remained flat. The district purchased new administrative offices but delayed classroom renovations, and there are some consulting fees that seem excessive. You think someone's skimming donations? I think someone's prioritizing the wrong things. And I think Vanessa's eagerness to silence my questions at these events might not be about embarrassment. He was quiet for a long moment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Vanessa has been very interested in maintaining the status quo at these fundraisers. She's consistently discouraged transparency questions and worked hard to keep donors from asking for detailed financial reports. You think she knows something?" "I think she's afraid of what might be discovered if people start paying attention to the numbers." The next school board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I spent the intervening days preparing like I was planning a military campaign. Margaret helped me compile a comprehensive analysis of the district's financial patterns, while I reached out to other parents who had expressed similar concerns about transparency over the years. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had questions. Sarah Mitchell, whose daughter was in Theo's class, had been wondering about the disconnect between fundraising goals and visible improvements. Tom Bradley, a CPA whose son played on the school's soccer team, had noticed discrepancies in the budget presentations. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had laughed at Vanessa's technology comment, admitted privately that she'd been curious about where all the auction money actually went. "I never said anything because Vanessa always shut down those conversations," Sarah told me during a coffee meeting. "She made it seem like asking questions was somehow attacking the teachers or undermining the school's mission." "Same here," Tom added. "Anytime someone brought up financial details, she'd redirect the conversation to volunteer opportunities or upcoming events." I nodded, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. What if I told you that over the past 6 years, parent donations have totaled over $2 million, but less than 60% of that has gone directly to student programs? Sarah nearly choked on her latte. Where did the rest go? Administrative costs, consulting fees, and what the district calls operational improvements. New carpet in the superintendent's office, upgraded furniture for the boardroom, professional development retreats at expensive resorts. Tom leaned forward. "You have documentation for this?" "Spreadsheets, receipts, and budget comparisons going back 6 years, all obtained through public records requests that I've been filing quarterly." "And Vanessa knew you were doing this?" "Vanessa knew I was asking questions. She didn't know I was getting answers." The school board meeting was held in the district's main conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and motivational posters about student achievement. The usual suspects were there: board members, a few teachers, and the handful of parents who showed up to these things out of civic duty or specific complaints. Vanessa arrived with David, both of them looking tense. She'd clearly dressed for battle in a sharp black suit and her most serious jewelry. David caught my eye across the room and nodded once. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. When public comment time arrived, I stood and walked to the front microphone. "My name is Eleanor Carter, and I'd like to discuss financial transparency in our fundraising efforts." Board Chair Patricia Wong smiled politely. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for your involvement in our school community. We always welcome parent input." "Thank you." Over the past 6 years, I've donated $380,000 to Riverside Elementary, and I've been requesting detailed financial reports for just as long. Tonight, I'd like to share what I've learned through my own research. I clicked my remote, and Margaret's carefully prepared presentation appeared on the wall screen. Charts and graphs showing the flow of donated money, budget allocations, and spending patterns that told a clear story of misplaced priorities. Parents have been extraordinarily generous, I continued. But administrative costs have increased by 48%, while classroom resources have remained essentially flat. We're paying more for management and less for education. Wong's smile grew strained. Mrs. Carter, I'm sure you understand that running a school district requires significant administrative support. I understand that paying $80,000 for retreat facilities while teachers buy their own supplies requires explanation. Murmurs rippled through the small audience. Vanessa's face had gone pale. The room's energy shifted palpably as I continued through the presentation. Each slide revealed another discrepancy: the $45,000 technology consultation that had produced no visible upgrades, the $30,000 spent on strategic planning retreats at luxury resorts, the steady increase in administrative salaries while support staff positions were eliminated. Furthermore, I said, advancing to the next slide, several parents have reported feeling discouraged from asking detailed questions about budget allocations at fundraising events. This suggests a pattern of discouraging transparency rather than promoting it. Board member James Sullivan cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, are you suggesting impropriety in our financial management? I'm suggesting that transparency shouldn't require a 6-year investigation by a concerned parent. When donors contribute significant amounts, they deserve clear accounting of how those funds are used. Behind me, I heard Vanessa whisper urgently to David, but I couldn't make out the words. Sarah Mitchell and Tom Bradley had moved to seats closer to the front, both taking notes. Let me be specific, I continued, clicking to a detailed breakdown. The playground equipment that parents were told cost $75,000 actually cost $52,000. The library renovation budgeted at $40,000 was completed for $28,000. In both cases, the difference was absorbed into administrative line items. Wong's composure finally cracked. Mrs. Carter, I think you may be misunderstanding some of the complexities involved in project management. I'm understanding that parents were told their donations would go towards specific improvements, and significant portions were redirected without their knowledge or consent. Superintendent Dr. Richard Hayes, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Mrs. Carter, do you have specific allegations of wrongdoing, or are you simply questioning our budgetary procedures? I'm questioning why those procedures aren't transparent to the people funding them. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Finally, Tom Bradley stood. I'd like to second Mrs. Carter's concerns. As a CPA, I can confirm that the financial reporting at our fundraising events lacks the detail that donors deserve. Sarah Mitchell rose next. I've been volunteering with fundraising for 4 years, and I've never seen breakdowns this detailed. Why haven't these numbers been shared with parents before? More parents began standing, voices joining in support of transparency. The momentum was building, and I could see panic starting to creep into the board members' expressions. Then Vanessa stood. I'd like to address some misconceptions, she said, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. Mrs. Carter has been challenging for our fundraising committees to work with. She's consistently questioned decisions that had already been finalized, created unnecessary complications at events, and frankly, made other parents uncomfortable with her confrontational approach. The room fell silent. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Mrs. Carter has been disruptive, Vanessa continued, gaining confidence. Tonight's presentation is just the latest example of her need to create problems where none exist. I smiled calmly. Mrs. Chen, could you please tell the board about last month's committee meeting? Lisa Chen, the PTA treasurer, looked surprised to be called upon. Which meeting? The one where you mentioned concerns about reconciling auction proceeds with deposited amounts. Lisa's face went pale. I don't think this is the appropriate forum. The one where Vanessa suggested you might be overthinking the bookkeeping. Vanessa's confident expression began to waver. Dr. Hayes stood slowly, his expression grave. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to hear what you have to say. Lisa Chen looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, but the room's attention was locked on her. There have been some discrepancies in our auction records, she admitted quietly. Small amounts but consistent over several events. How small? Hayes asked. Between $2,000 and $5,000 per event, typically. The final totals never quite matched what we should have collected based on winning bids. Wong leaned forward. And you reported these concerns? I mentioned them to Vanessa, since she coordinates the events. She said there were always administrative costs that came out before the final tally, and that I shouldn't worry about the details. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to gray. That's not, there are always expenses. What kind of expenses? Dr. Hayes's voice had taken on an edge that suggested this conversation was moving beyond the scope of a routine board meeting. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. According to the receipts I've collected, the administrative costs for our last 3 fundraisers included catering for post-event celebrations that most volunteers weren't invited to, professional photography that was never shared with parents, and transportation costs for events that were held on school property. Tom Bradley was frantically taking notes. Mrs. Carter, how did you obtain these receipts? Public records requests. All of this information was available to anyone who asked for it. The problem is that no one was encouraged to ask. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the tension. Vanessa, you've been telling us for years that asking for detailed financial information was inappropriate, that we should trust the process. The process works fine when people don't interfere. Interfere? I interrupted. Is that what you call donors wanting to know how their money is spent? Dr. Hayes held up his hand for silence. Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Chen, I'm going to need both of you to provide detailed documentation to our district auditor. Mrs. Carter, he turned to Vanessa, I think we need to have a separate conversation about fundraising protocols. The formal meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but the real business was finished. The board voted unanimously to conduct a comprehensive audit of all fundraising activities over the past 5 years, to implement new transparency requirements for future events, and to establish a parent oversight committee for budget reporting. As people filed out, Vanessa remained seated, staring at the table in front of her. David sat beside her, but the space between them seemed to have grown wider during the course of the evening. I gathered my materials slowly, giving them space to process what had just happened. As I reached the door, David called my name. Mom. I turned back. His expression was complicated, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been respect, all competing for dominance. Why didn't you just tell us? He asked quietly. About the money, about the investigation, about all of it. Because you wouldn't have believed me, I said simply. And Vanessa would have found a way to shut it down before the truth came out. He glanced at his wife, who was still sitting motionless at the conference table. What happens now? Now you decide whether you want a mother-in-law who stays quiet or a mother who tells the truth. 3 weeks later, the district auditor's preliminary report confirmed what my 6-year investigation had suggested. Approximately $127,000 in fundraising proceeds had been misallocated over the past 5 years. The money hadn't been stolen exactly, but it had been redirected to administrative enhancements without donor knowledge or consent. Vanessa resigned from all school committees the day the report was released. The story made regional news when Channel 7 picked up the angle about the anonymous donor who had exposed systemic financial mismanagement. Local grandmother's secret generosity reveals school district budget issues ran for 3 days, with interviews from grateful teachers, surprised parents, and a very uncomfortable superintendent. I declined most interview requests, but I did agree to speak with the education reporter from the county newspaper. Margaret advised me that transparency about my giving might encourage other donors to ask better questions about their contributions. "Mrs. Carter," the reporter asked, "what motivated you to maintain your anonymity for so long?" "Charity should be about the recipients, not the giver," I replied. "But accountability should be about the truth, not politeness." The Riverside Elementary Spring Showcase, their replacement for the traditional fundraiser, was held on a Saturday afternoon in May. Instead of a silent auction with inflated administrative costs, they organized a celebration of student achievements with transparent financial reporting displayed prominently near the entrance. I arrived early, wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn to that fateful fundraiser, but this time I walked directly to the front of the gymnasium. Principal Morrison had reserved a seat for me at the VIP table, a designation that made me uncomfortable but seemed important to him. "Mrs. Carter," he approached with a wide smile, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. The new transparency requirements are already making a difference. 3 other parents have stepped forward with questions about previous year's spending." "Good," I said simply. "Questions make everyone more careful with the answers." David and Theo arrived together, but without Vanessa. My grandson hugged me tightly, something that had become more frequent since the board meeting revelations. "Grandma Eleanor," he said, using the formal name Vanessa had insisted upon for years. "Dad says you're the reason our school has the cool playground." "One of the reasons," I corrected. "A lot of people contributed to making your school better. But you contributed the most." I looked at David, who was watching our interaction with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sometimes the most important contribution isn't money, Theo. It's making sure the money gets used properly." The showcase proceeded smoothly, with students displaying art projects, performing musical numbers, and demonstrating science experiments. The financial reports were available at 3 different stations, with board members and parent volunteers available to answer questions. Several parents approached me throughout the afternoon, some to thank me for my donations, others to ask advice about evaluating other charitable organizations. As the event wound down, Sarah Mitchell joined me at my table. "Eleanor, a few of us have been talking. We'd like to start a donor advocacy group, not just for the school, but for all the local nonprofits. Would you consider serving as an advisor?" I considered the offer. For 6 years, I'd been working alone, asking questions that others were afraid to voice, investigating patterns that others chose to ignore. The idea of having allies in that work was appealing. What would that involve? Teaching other donors how to ask the right questions, how to request proper documentation, how to ensure their contributions make the maximum impact. Tom Bradley appeared beside us. "Think of it as quality control for charity." I smiled. I like that description. 6 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen, the same table where I'd been paying bills and managing my secret charitable empire for years, when David knocked on the back door. He'd been visiting more frequently since the school board revelations, sometimes with Theo, sometimes alone. Today he carried a manila folder and wore the expression he'd inherited from his father when dealing with difficult conversations. "Mom, we need to talk about your will." I poured him coffee in his father's old mug. What about it? Vanessa's been asking questions about your estate, about how much you actually have, about what happens to it when you die. And what did you tell her? I told her it wasn't her business. He paused. But then I realized I don't actually know the answer either. I sat across from him, noting the gray threading through his hair and the lines around his eyes that made him look more like his father every year. What would you like to know? Everything. How much there really is, where it came from, what your plans are. And Mom, I want to understand why you've been handling this alone for so long. I opened the folder he'd brought and found documents I recognized. Margaret's latest quarterly report on my portfolio's performance. You've been doing research. I asked Margaret to walk me through your financial situation, with your permission, of course. And I learned that $380,000 to the school was just the beginning. Mom, you're worth almost $3 million. I nodded. Robert was better at business than anyone gave him credit for, and I've been careful with the money. Careful and generous. Margaret showed me the full list of your donations. The food bank, the literacy program, the scholarship funds, the medical assistance program. Mom, you've given away almost $1 million in 6 years. Money that's been put to good use. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help you decide how to allocate it? I sipped my coffee, choosing my words carefully. Because for the first 5 years after Robert died, every financial conversation we had ended with you and Vanessa explaining why I needed to be more conservative with my spending. You were worried I'd outlive my money. He winced. We were trying to protect you. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. And now? Now I'm 73 years old. I have more money than I can spend in my remaining years, and I figured out how to make it matter. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. The donor advocacy group, that's going to be your next project? Among other things, there are a lot of organizations in this county that could benefit from someone asking the right questions. Someone like you? Someone like us, I corrected. If you're interested. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. I'm interested. But Mom, what about Vanessa? This whole situation has been hard on her. I considered my answer carefully. Vanessa is welcome to join us if she's genuinely committed to transparency and accountability. But she's not welcome to control the conversation anymore. She's been seeing a therapist, working through some issues about control and family dynamics. Good, that's healthy. She wants to apologize to you. Properly, not just the quick sorry she mumbled at the school meeting. I thought about the woman who had spent years trying to silence me, diminish me, and ultimately exclude me from my own family's activities. I thought about the public humiliation, the condescending laughter, the careful campaign to make me feel irrelevant. David, I don't need an apology. I need a change in behavior. Fair enough. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mom? I'm proud of what you did. It took courage to stand up at that board meeting, knowing it would change everything. It took patience to wait 6 years for the right moment. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by the familiar papers of my ongoing charitable work. The donor advocacy group was meeting next week. The literacy program needed funding for their expansion. The food bank had requested help with a new refrigeration system. My phone buzzed with a text from Theo. Grandma Eleanor, thank you for making our school awesome. Love you. I smiled and typed back, love you too, sweetheart. See you Sunday. The evening light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the financial documents that told the story of my secret generosity. For 6 years, I'd worked in the shadows, giving quietly while enduring public diminishment. But silence had its purpose, and so did speaking up. The truth had a way of surfacing when it was ready, and when it did, it changed everything. They told me to stay quiet. Instead, I learned to make my actions louder than their words.